Welcome back to our NPTEL course on memory device technology for AI/ML based computing. So please let's try to recall what we studied in the previous class. In the previous class, we concluded by looking at how there is a dramatic shift in compute paradigms over the last few decades. We have moved significantly from logic-centric paradigm to the data-centric paradigm. So one of the questions we asked was what enabled the shift, and the answer was it was the availability of big data through advances in memory and storage technology. However, we also saw while there are the significant changes in memory and storage technology, the computational architecture on which all these algorithms are working have not really changed dramatically. So there is no change in the fundamental architecture of modern day computing. To have a deeper understanding, in this class, we will see what is the fundamental architecture of modern day computing. So let us begin our class for today, and as we discussed last time also, it is the so-called von Neumann architecture. So what is the von Neumann architecture? But before that, what was the need for the von Neumann architecture? So von Neumann architecture was postulated by John von Neumann in 1945 during the Manhattan Project. So as you know, the Manhattan Project was the atomic bomb project. There, lot of intense calculations were done by human computers. But soon people realized that there are limitations in accuracy and throughput of these human computers. Therefore, people started looking at how we can make machines do computing. The von Neumann architecture is one of the first thoughts or one of the earliest architectures to enable computing in artificial systems. Let us look at the structural components of the von Neumann architecture first. As you can see, structurally, the von Neumann architecture is very simple. It consists of two main entities. One is the logic or CPU element, and another is the memory element. Both these elements are spatially and functionally distinct. What does this mean? Spatially distinct means they are at different places in space. They are not co-located. Functionally separate simply means that they are performing entirely distinct functions that we will describe very soon. Now, if an architecture has spatially different two elements which are working in cohesion, of course they need to be connected. So this is connection. The connection or the data communication channel is nothing but the address and the data bus. So the address bus, as you can see in the figure, is a unidirectional bus going from the logic to the memory. After discussing the address bus, let's look at the bidirectional data bus. The data bus is responsible for facilitating read and write operations, read from the memory and write to the memory from the logic elements. That is why it is a bidirectional bus. Once we have understood how the von Neumann architecture is structurally, let's look at the functionality. As you may be already aware of, the job of the logic element is to take in raw data, process the raw data based on certain instructions, and give out the processed data. Whereas the objective or the functionality of the memory element is very simple. It is to retain the raw data which needs to be processed, the processed data after the logic has done its job, and also what is the computer software or the code which will tell the logic element what are the sequence of steps it needs to do. Next, it will be worthwhile to go into a deeper dive of what are the constituent functional elements in the logic and memory element. Let's first focus on the logic part. The logic part primarily consists of three important portions. The first, which you can say the most important function as marked out in green, or the most important part as marked out in green, is the ALU, or the arithmetic logic unit. You can say this is the most important part or the heart of the logic element because it will do all the mathematical and logic operations which the CPU is supposed to do. This is facilitated by two other elements. One is a local register and the other is the control unit. What is the role of the local register? It is very simple. It is to behave like memory element or storage element for the most recent operations that will be done in the arithmetic logic unit. It will contain the most recent data which is required by the ALU or which is pushed out by the ALU. As you can understand, there is a lot of data movement and data processing which is happening within the logic and from the logic to the memory. All of this is controlled or this is facilitated or synchronized by the control unit. An important thing to know about registers is that often we have heard when we buy computers or laptops, or even when we download software, we say that it's a 32-bit software or 64-bit software. What is this 32 or 64 bits? It is generally the size of these internal registers. Okay, now that we have understood functionally what the logic or the CPU element is, let us carefully look at what the memory element is. As you can see from the diagram, the memory element consists of an array of addressable memory cells which stores data. Here the key technical term is addressable. What does this mean that it is addressable? It means that every memory location has a unique ID or address which can be accessed by asserting that particular address on the address bus from the logic element. So now we have a clear top view understanding of the structural and functional properties or the functional elements in the von Neumann architecture. Next, to get a deeper understanding of things, we will see how a very simple operation, in this case, addition of two numbers sitting in memory locations A and B, is facilitated in the von Neumann architecture. Most of you are familiar with high-level coding, such as C, C++, or Python. What happens in the actual hardware, in the von Neumann architectural hardware, when you write in C or C++ just one line code of adding two numbers? How does it get transformed and operationalized in the von Neumann architecture is what we will try to understand in this slide, and this will give us very key insights about what are the strengths and also bottlenecks in the von Neumann architecture. So let us begin. The process that we are trying to do over here is there are two numbers in memory location A and memory location B. The idea is to add these two numbers and then store it back in another memory location C. Generally, when you write code in high-level language, that is not really understandable by the CPU. So you have to convert it into so-called assembly code. The assembly code is language or code which is understandable by the CPU. The CPU assembly code consists of the instruction set architecture, which lists out instructions which is understandable by the CPU. Some of the examples you can see in the code that I have illustrated over here, such as load, add, store, are some of the instructions within the instruction set architecture. Here what is happening is, the first thing you are doing in this assembly code is load R1 if you see these square brackets, it means from memory location A. So load R1 from A simply does the job of feeding the data contained in memory location A to the register R1, which is an internal register. Please recall, R1 is the internal register within the CPU, whereas A is a memory location which is far away from the CPU. That's correct. Next is load R2 into B, just identical. The contents of memory, contents of whatever is in memory location B will get fed into R2. Next is add R3 into R3, R1, R2. This simply means whatever are the numbers in R1 and R2 will get added in the arithmetic logic unit, and the result will be stored in R3. Now there is a small technicality over here that a 32-bit number, considering this is a 32-bit processor, the addition of two 32-bit numbers may not necessarily be 32 bits, it might be more than that. But we are not going into the complications of that situation. We are just trying to see in a generic situation how does the von Neumann architecture add two numbers. Okay, so we are not going into too many details, we are looking from a little higher perspective. Okay, the final operation is store R3 into memory location C. And this, as you can understand, tells the control unit to feed back whatever is the contents of R3 back into a memory location C, which is in the external memory. Okay, so this is what the storage, assembly code facilitates. Now we will see how the assembly code facilitates all this by looking at the data movement. So let us break down the assembly code further down into physical data movement. So what is the first process that will happen? In order to read what is written in memory location A, first CPU will assert the appropriate address of A on the address bus. As a result, through the memory controller, you will get the data which was stored in memory location A. This is then routed through the control unit into register R1. Is that fine? Okay. Next, as you can imagine, will be the exact same process of sequence for what is in memory location B. The address at B will be asserted in the address bus, and the data corresponding to B will go and sit in the register R2. Right? What was the next step? It was add R3, R2, R1. That means the arithmetic logic unit will be fed with the contents of R1 and R2, and the summation will be stored in R3. The final step, as we know, will be asserting the address of C, which is a new memory location where you want to feed back the output, and the addition of A plus B is fed back to memory location C and written back to C. So through these detailed steps, the von Neumann architecture performs a very simple operation of A plus B and stores it back into memory location C. What did we learn from this sequence of steps is what we will try to encapsulate in the next slide. And I think it is very important to remember these important aspects of a von Neumann architecture before we move further. So what are the key insights that we gained through this study? The first important insight, which is obvious, but we will soon see why I am emphasizing it several times, is that in von Neumann architecture, you have separate logic and memory elements. Functionally separate, spatially separate. The next important element we see is this kind of computing or this kind of architecture is essentially deterministic. Remember from the previous lecture, what is the meaning of deterministic? Deterministic means there are a set of predefined steps that the computing system will go through to give you the final output. In other sense, you can say everything is programmed. Next important element is, you will see all these steps which are predetermined are happening one after the other, or it is essentially sequential. So in a sense, von Neumann systems have very limited inherent parallelism. Of course, you try to inbuilt parallelism by having multi-cores, multi-threads, or even pipelining. But fundamentally, von Neumann architecture is a sequential process or facilitates sequential running of code and processes. The next important thing is, if it is really sequential, how is all of this synchronized? As you may all know, it is done through the so-called system clock. All events happen either in the rising or falling edge of the clock. So essentially, von Neumann architecture is synchronous. Finally, which may not be a very important point, but is the case for 99.999% of all implementations of the von Neumann architecture, they are inherently digital. They work only on zeros and ones and not analog. I have placed a box around all these important features of the von Neumann architecture, which were very obvious through the previous example. What am I going to contrast it against? I am going to contrast this against the human brain. I want you to think very carefully. Take a moment to pause this video, go through these steps or the features of von Neumann architecture and ask yourself, is this how the human brain works? So take a moment. So you might have come back and paused the video and thought, and what you might have really jumped upon or might have been very obvious to you is all these features, which is the essential part of von Neumann computing, is absolutely antithetical to the working of biological systems or the human brain. The human brain is not deterministic or programmed. There is not one set of code which God or nature has written. It is not sequential. You are doing several processes at the same time. There is inbuilt parallelism, inherent parallelism in biological systems. Nothing is synchronous. There is not a system clock running through your brain. All events, as you will see, all computing is event driven and asynchronous. And the implementation is inherently analog. So while von Neumann systems have really stood the test of time and have ushered in the age of modern day computing, they fall quite short of the essential features of biological computing. And that is why, while we are being able to write AI/ML based code and artificial intelligence, we are able to implement in algorithms, because you are running, or rather I would say force feeding AI algorithms on von Neumann architecture. There is an inherent mismatch between how the human brain works or biological computing works and the von Neumann architecture on which these AI algorithms are being run. And this, as you will see, causes huge amount of latency and power consumption. Also, it will be very important to ask, what is the bottleneck in so-called data-centric computing? When you try to run data-centric paradigms, computing paradigms on von Neumann architecture, what becomes the bottleneck? In this entire element, what becomes the bottleneck? The initial tendency, because we are talking about data and memory centric, you might want to think that the bottleneck becomes this memory. But think again. If you look at the previous slide, we saw when you are adding two numbers A and B, the actual addition portion was a very tiny fraction of all the steps that were taking place. Most of the time or the operation went into shuttling data back and forth from the memory to the CPU element and within the CPU. And this becomes the key bottleneck when we go from logic-centric paradigm to data-centric paradigm. And this is what causes the latency and power consumption that we were talking about, and we will discuss in lot of detail in the second part of our course. Now, as we promised for the first part of the course, we will do a very specific deep dive into this simple looking memory element. Although this memory element looks very simple and functionally is also very simple, you will see the implementation is far from simple. It is really complicated because the needs have become so evolved. And that is what we will look in the next class when we look at why we need a hierarchy of memory, just not one memory block. A hierarchy of memory, what is the rationale for it, and how do we implement it. So, thank you for your attention in this part of the thank you for your attention for this lecture. Please recall, we saw while the von Neumann architecture has done a great service in pushing the boundaries of modern day computing, since it is inherently deterministic, sequential and clocked, and quite antithetical to the human brain, the separate memory and logic elements and the data bus connecting them becomes a big bottleneck, because now you are trying to shuttle data back and forth quite frequently in data-centric paradigm. Thank you. See you in the next lecture.